Breathe in, hold it, and breathe out. Sometimes we forget to breathe. And yesterday, the world changed. The world changed because a 17-year-old Black girl took out her phone, and despite threats, despite intimidation by people in authority, despite her own trauma and fear, she made a decision, a very brave decision to bear witness. And it was her bravery that literally forced a reckoning in America. Because Darnella Frazier took out her phone and began recording. As the world, we collectively witnessed George Floyd taking his last breath. And even though it was a shared experience that we all witnessed together, somehow we still found ourselves yesterday holding our breath as we waited for the verdict that would ultimately declare Derek Chauvin guilty. So if we all watched the same thing, why were we holding our breath? Well, probably because experience bias reminds us that justice has not always been just to us. We held our breath wondering if we would ever be able to exhale in the various institutions and organizations that were literally crushing our spirits. We held our breath from the heaviness of the weight that it is to bear witness, praying for it not to be in vain and hoping that it will produce real change. What happened to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Dante Wright, and countless others is the most tragic and extreme example of what happens to Black and brown, disabled and gay, elderly and immigrant, trans and non-binary people every single day. Not in the sense that they are killed by law enforcement, but in the reality, the daily reality that in their neighborhoods, their places of employment, and yes, even sometimes on television and movie production sets, they are expected to trust systems and structures that are supposed to be designed to protect them, that oftentimes are the purveyors of their very harm. Be it law enforcement, HR organizations, management. They are repeatedly victimized and subsequently blamed for their abuse and then gaslit for calling it out. They are physically fatigued and emotionally exhausted from the labor of defending their own humanity. So what can we learn from Darnella Frazier's bravery? We can follow her example. Darnella bore witness. She inspected the situation and made an accurate account. So what does that mean for you and I? It means we should be inspecting how our inputs and our individual decisions inform our aggregate and current results. We should not only track who got the job, but we should be tracking and inspecting who got the interview or the audition in the first place. We should be inspecting organizational decisions that lead to assigning the hardest problem to solve or the biggest projects, because those are the projects that make someone promotion eligible. We should be relentless in calling out double standards that are weaponized against underrepresented and often marginalized people. George Floyd was literally trying to breathe, but characterized as resisting arrest. Social justice warriors like Darnella, who oftentimes are Black women accused of being agitators and angry. But what else can we learn from Darnella? She used her body, her resources, and her power to fight injustice. As leaders in this industry, we have to be willing to use our body, our resources, and power to dismantle systems of inequity, of racism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. How are we using our bodies? What listening circles are we in? Whose voices are we centering? Who are we reading? Whose voices are we amplifying? Darnella's only resource was a camera. We have the luxury of having many resources at our disposal, including time and money and staff. And while we know power usually comes from position, when we have authority over others or influence, our ability to persuade or convince, to advocate, Darnella, that young teenage woman, is proof that we are never powerless. She didn't have positional authority, but she fully understood her ability to influence by capturing and sharing the truth via social media. We have the ability to make policies, to make terms and conditions and contracts, to write checks and to mandate organizational goals. Are we being like Darnella? Are we actively making individual choices and decisions that differ from the status quo? But Darnella did something else. She called for pressure change, but insisted and ensured structural change. In the moment, she urged Derek Chauvin to relieve the pressure on George Floyd's neck, but she didn't stop there. She documented the incident. She went to court. She testified in an effort to break the cycle of any future law enforcement officer being able to use the excuse that they were following reasonable training and protocol. So yes, in the heat of the moment, call for pressure change. Use your social media platforms. Use your hashtags. Hold town halls for your employees and customers, but don't stop there. You also have to use mechanisms to disrupt status quo. We collectively have to create policy to ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion is a part of every green light decision. That we establish content reviews to put a speed bump to stop harmful stereotypes, tropes, and other forms of lazy writing. We have to open up our checkbooks to fund the efforts of Streetlights and Gold House and Illuminative and GLAAD and Color of Change and any other organization on the front lines of creating access, exposure, and structural change. We have to set expectations with talent in a real way. Not just the statements that say we strive to be better, but actually real inclusion policies with rigor and accountability. We can no longer tolerate or excuse bad behavior from bullies or closed-minded people who may have had long dominated our industry but refused to change. Darnella challenged the system to live up to its potential. And it's time for us to put those same systems of inequality on trial. Systems of patriarchy, oppression, white supremacy. And I'm not talking about white supremacy as an individual. I'm not even talking about it as a system of morals or values. I'm talking about something far more sinister. It's the humdrum of the everyday. I'm talking about a system designed for and intended to keep certain people in power at the exclusion and expense of others. A system that will seek homeostasis unless it is intentionally disrupted. See, very few people wake up and decide to actively disenfranchise women, people of color, and trans people from telling their stories in authentic ways. Instead, we make a series of small, individual decisions around casting, production and marketing budgets, distribution strategies that can do harm simply because they maintain the status quo. Thank God Darnella didn't maintain status quo. She didn't just walk into Cup Foods that day to buy snacks on 38th Street in Chicago and Minneapolis and walk home with her younger cousin. Thank you, Darnella Frazier, for reminding us that courage is not about being fearless. It's usually about being very afraid and doing the right thing anyway. So if you will with me again, breathe in and breathe out.